Good morning, everybody. I invite you to turn to your Old Testaments for a little bit to the book of Exodus in chapter 19. We're going to make our way to Matthew 5 in a little bit, but we're going to start in Exodus 19. While you're turning there, let me just say how good it was to go to the house of mourning with some of you yesterday, to weep with those who weep at Ruby Brad's funeral, to be there for the Bredens and the Brads and those who love them. I told Ashley after the fact that it was even harder to be there than I thought it would be, but it was really good. It was really good. It was good to remember the life of a little girl who brought such joy to so many people. It was good to be reminded that she no longer suffers, that she's with our Lord. It was good to be reminded of the fact that our own lives are like a vapor, like James says. And it was good to be reminded that there is a resurrection day coming. I tell you what, it can't come soon enough. It's good to be with you today in the house of worship, to take whatever's going on in our hearts and our lives and to bring them all together and to lay them at the feet of our King, who cares more about us than we can possibly imagine. It's good to be here, and it's good to be with you now, and it's good to be in His Word. I want to ask a question that I'm going to keep asking in different ways as we go through this year of Matthew lessons. A question that I think Matthew is going to answer in a lot of different ways. What is the kingdom of heaven about? What's it about? What does it mean to be a part of it? What does it mean that it came to planet Earth? I think a lot of people would answer that question in a lot of different ways. Throughout history, maybe in the time of the Crusades, for example, some people would say, well, the kingdom of heaven is about controlling certain physical territory. That's what kingdoms do, right? It's not what the kingdom of heaven is all about. Some people would say the kingdom of heaven is about armies physically marching into battle and beating up on a foe, on an enemy. But that's not really what the kingdom of heaven is about either, because in the garden, you remember how Peter starts slashing with his sword, starts cutting off ears, and Jesus says, no, put your sword away, I'm going to put the ear back on Malchus, and we stop doing that because that's not what this is about. And you remember how later on he told Pilate, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, then my servants would be fighting for me. So that's not what the kingdom of heaven is about. Does it come through making sure that the right humans are in public office in government? Is human government and the power that human government wields, is that the primary agent of gospel change in the world? I don't think so. Does it come through focusing on big social changes, of supporting broad organizations that will reshape the country that I live in right now, whatever country that might happen to be at the time? Is that what the kingdom's about? I think Jesus would answer this question differently than a lot of people would. Maybe even differently than perhaps some of us here. The kingdom of heaven is about putting God's rule inside of individual hearts so that we become healed from our brokenness, so that we become complete from our emptiness, so that we become changed people, so that we can then be used to be God's agents for other people's hearts. And in a nutshell, I think that's what Matthew 5 through 7 is all about, what we will typically call the Sermon on the Mount. This is Jesus' answer for his disciples and anybody else on that mountain about what the kingdom was and what people look like when they are transformed by this kingdom. As we start out, I want to flash this back up on the screen. Several lessons ago, I put this in front of your eyes to suggest that the book of Matthew, especially the first part of the book of Matthew, is a retelling of the Exodus story. That when we see Jesus going down to Egypt and then leaving Egypt, when we see Jesus being baptized in the Jordan River, even though he hadn't committed a single sin, unlike everybody else there, including John the Baptist, when we see Jesus going to the wilderness in chapter 4 and being tempted by the devil there and passing his temptations with flying colors, and then finally when we hit Matthew 5, and we see him going up to a mountain and teaching his people some wonderful things, that all of this is just taking the Exodus story and reframing it now and saying, this is the new Moses who has come. And it's a better Moses because he's not just taking us from physical chains. No longer do we have to build pyramids anymore. No, what he's doing is he's taking us from spiritual bondage, spiritual slavery to the devil, and setting our souls free so that we don't have to serve that oppressive master, which Moses couldn't have done for the Israelites. He became like us so that he could free us. And so what I want to do is, as we enter Matthew 5, I want to think about Mount Sinai. And I want to think about it right alongside of this mountain in Galilee where Jesus went. I want you to think about there in Exodus 19 how God talked about wanting a kingdom long before Jesus and John showed up on the scene. But I want you to notice how it's talked about. It's in terms of intention. It's in terms of, yeah, I know this isn't really actually completely going to happen in the way that I want it to, but this is the intention for you guys. Look at Exodus 19, 3 through 6. Moses went up to God. God called out to him from the mountain and said, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, tell the people of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings," which is such a cool image, "and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if there's the word. There's the big but little word. If you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel." But despite the intentions that God had for his people, what do we know happened with the Exodus story? Well, you keep reading in Exodus, and Moses is still up on the mountain getting the law, and the people have very quickly given up on him. They've gone to his brother and said, "We don't know what's happened with Moses, but we want a God to worship, so make us one." So Aaron does. And from that time on, in Israel's long history, there would be so many instances like the golden calf. On a national scale and on an individual scale, even the good people, even the Davids, mess up horribly. And they don't fully fulfill God's plan, his expectations for a kingdom of priests, a nation of mediators between the nations of the world and God himself. They don't do that. Something else I want you to notice about Exodus 19 that's going to be really important when we get to Matthew 5 is that, did you notice what happens when Moses goes up to God? When I was growing up and I would read the Exodus story, I had this mental picture in my mind that what happened was Moses went up once and he came down once holding the tablets. But actually, when you read the text very carefully, especially in Exodus 19, you'll notice that actually Moses goes up and down the mountain several different times. And so when he's up there, I believe it's the first time, God will say, I want you to go down there, and I want you to set up boundaries. So reading from Exodus 19, verse 12, you shall set limits, barriers, for the people all around, saying, take care not to go up into the mountain or touch the edge of it. Whoever touches the mountain shall be put to death. So he's preparing the people to come and marry him in this covenant ceremony, so to speak. You ever been to a place where celebrities were, or at least seen pictures of what happens when celebrities go to places where there are a lot of people? Their people will often come ahead of time and set up these barricades on the street or wherever the celebrity is so that you can get kind of close, but you won't get too close to these VIP people. And that's, I think, the basic idea of what's happening here, except the consequences of passing the barrier and trying to touch the mountain and go up is death. Not just you're going to get tackled by somebody's bodyguard. And so he tells Moses, go down, set up these very firm boundaries, and you make these big distinctions, these lines in the sand, and you make sure those people do not come near me. And so Moses does, and then he goes back up the mountain after he does that. And it's really interesting that when he gets back to the top, God actually tells him to go back down again and warn the people not to go near the mountain. And it's funny, it's almost humorous. In verse 23 of Exodus 19, where Moses just says, well, God, I mean, the people can't go up to the mountain because you just told me to set up boundaries, and I did that. And so, kind of the sense of, do I need to go back down there and kind of do this again? God says, yes. You need to go back down, and you need to tell the people the same thing that you already told them. And so we got to go through this a couple of different times in order for God to pound in the point that you cannot touch me. You cannot go near me. I'm going to come down kind of close to you, but you better not come up to me. Not that the people really wanted to do that anyway, because when you get to the scene where God finally comes down to the mountain, Israel is consecrated, they're standing before God, and they are absolutely terrified. This is not a casual conversation taking place over a cup of coffee at a coffee shop. This is God, the Creator, showing a very small fraction of His majesty to a people who didn't really know what to do with that. For the Lord of the Rings fans out there, of which there are several, think about Mount Doom as the picture of Mount Sinai, except without the orcs and without the lava and without the eye. But that's basically the picture here. God comes down, it's dark, it's stormy, it looks like Mordor, right? There's fire, and then there's this bone-shaking voice that speaks from the gloom and the fire and whatever else was there. And even Moses was scared. And Moses was allowed to go up on the mountain. But Hebrews 12 actually tells us, Hebrews 12:21, indeed, so terrifying was the sight that Moses said, I tremble with fear. And you remember that the people actually said to Moses, we can't take this. Like, if he's going to speak to us, we're going to die. So you go up there, you get close to that God, and you talk to him. And then whatever he tells you, we're going to do that. But you be the person who deals with that. And so he does. And I think it's interesting, in Deuteronomy 5, Moses is looking back on this scene, and he recounts what God told him at that moment when the people were so frightened. God didn't say, oh, did I scare you? I'm sorry. I'll do better next time. God said to Moses, I'm glad they fear me. In fact, I wish that, Deuteronomy 5:29, they would always have a heart to fear me like they do at this moment, because it's going to quickly evaporate. So I want you to think about now what happens in Matthew 5. Because it's a very different mountain scene that we've got going on here with the new covenant arising amongst Jesus' people. Notice, he doesn't just speak of his desire, his expectations that he knows are not going to be actually fulfilled. He's speaking about the kingdom is coming, and it is not going to be contingent on your actions. I am bringing it in. It's going to be a reality. It's not just going to be well, here's what I'd like for you to do, but I know you're not going to do it. Matthew 4:17, we've read that already. We've studied that. It's exactly the same thing that John said before Jesus. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. It's coming. And we get to decide whether it's going to conquer our individual hearts or not, but it came. Jesus brought it. His reign and his rule were inevitable, and he's going to build it through the end of chapter 4 people, the people who are sick and afflicted with various diseases and pains, physically, spiritually. Jesus' kingdom is different. It's going to embrace weak people, people who mourn, people who are suffering in different ways and who know it. They are going to come to Jesus and reap its rewards. And then I want you to read again Matthew 5, verse 1. When you understand what happened in the Exodus story, Matthew 5, verse 1 leaps off the page. Seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and when he sat down, his disciples came to him. Do you see that? The Old Testament mountain was forbidden. Multiple times God said, don't touch it. Moses can go up. The rest of you better stay right there apart from me. And yet here in Matthew 5, the people come up with Jesus to have this intimate kind of conversation with him about the kingdom that he was creating. In Exodus, Moses alone goes up to talk to God and then come back down to the people as a mediator. But in Matthew 5, God himself is a human. He is the mediator, and so you can come up and there's not this dark, stormy, fire, gloom picture here. It's just Jesus pulling people close. That's what the new covenant does. That's what God always wanted to do. But he had to show us Mount Sinai before he could show us Mount Galilee. Right? Do you believe that he wants you like this? Something to think about as we move through this. Instead of 10 Commandments at the very beginning with the booming voice and the fire and gloom, notice how this sermon starts a very different way, with a list, but a very different kind of list. We've got 9 blessings that are being spoken of here. It's interesting how in the law, Moses was given a lot of stuff to say to the people about the construction of the tabernacle and purity and sacrifices and what the priests were supposed to do. I'm in the middle of Leviticus in my daily Bible reading, and there is a lot of detail. But it starts with 10 commandments. Here's the core of the law. You shall love the Lord your God, and here's what that means in several different ways. And in the Sermon on the Mount, there's a lot in Matthew 5 through 7. We're going to look at all those details. But it starts with a description of the kind of people who God blesses. And it's a beautiful picture of what he can do with people who truly follow Jesus. All right, so let's get into 2 through 12. Now that we got the background in our minds, If you are using a Bible that has subheadings in it, chances are you will have in Matthew 5 a subheading called the Beatitudes. What does that mean? Well, I'm just going to throw both of these points up at the same time because they kind of go together. Is this a word that just means, these are attitudes that we need to be? Well, no, not exactly. The beatitude, it actually comes from a Latin word, beatus, which means blessed or happy. And you'll notice in verses 3 through 11, nearly every verse begins with the word blessed. But what does that mean, to be blessed in these kinds of ways? It is not a description, this is very important, it is not a description of how these people are feeling, how we are feeling as these things are being described. It's about a relationship. It's about a secure status between us and God, that I know that I'm safe with Him. That word is just a little tricky to translate into our language. It does, if you look it up in the dictionary, it does mean something like happiness, but that's a little misleading because we use the word happy to describe a lot of things that make us feel good. I'm a coffee drinker. I'm sorry for those of you who aren't. You're missing out. I'm happy when I have my morning coffee. I am happy. I feel good when I eat one of my wife's homemade cinnamon rolls, which I get every birthday. That's not the idea of these verses. And it's obvious when you read down through these. When you get to verse 4, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. When you're mourning, or later on in the Beatitudes, when you are being reviled and persecuted, when all kinds of evil is being hurled against you falsely for Jesus' name, do you feel good in those moments? I don't think so. You don't feel happy, but you are blessed in that you're connected with God, and that makes you fortunate, even if you don't feel good at the moment. God looks at you with approval. And so when we think about the Beatitudes, I think it's important to make this point that this is not a moral to-do list, but rather an explanation of how Jesus changes people who attach themselves to Him. This is not so much about what you do. This is about what Jesus does to you when you follow Him. Because you notice how there are almost no commands in the Beatitudes. Have you ever noticed that? Blessed are those who are like this. Blessed are those who are like this. Blessed are those who are like this. Now, verse 12 is the exception to the rule. In verse 12, there's one command right there, and we'll look at that in just a little bit. But for the most part, Jesus isn't saying, do this, y'all, do that. It's a place where He's describing what He does. We don't follow a list of rules. We follow a person. We follow Jesus. And the more that you love His words and His actions, the more you will become like the kind of person that He pictures here. So, without further ado, let's get into these. Blessed are those who are poor. Poor how? Poor in spirit. In other words, the people who recognize their own spiritual bankruptcy, those are the people who are going to be accepted by the God who has all things. The word that we translate as poor here is kind of interesting. It comes from a root word that means to cower or to beg. So this is a picture of somebody who is absolutely destitute. They don't have a red cent to their name. And what do they pour in? Well, the word spirit, whether you're looking at the Greek word or you're looking at the Hebrew word in Old Testament passages that have the word spirit, either way, it means breath or it means wind. That kind of idea. So I think Jesus is saying poor in spirit as in people who are not windbags. People who are not puffed up with themselves, and people who understand who they are in relation to God. Jesus is saying right off the bat, in the very first words of this magnificent sermon, I only take people on my team who know that they are no good. I enjoy basketball. I'm not very good at basketball. I enjoy it. What if I went to Chicago and I talked to the Bulls about joining their team? And I said to them, I really like basketball. I'm not that good. My dribbling's not great. I get tired when I run, maybe 3 or 4 times down the court. And I'm not Steph Curry. I can't shoot very well, but I'm willing to learn. Do you think the Bulls are going to say, yeah, we'll put you in it forward in the next game? I don't think so. They're going to say, take a hike. And they would be right to do that. Because on the Bulls team, the people who are there because they are already good, right? But Jesus would say, we go to him and we say, look, I've got so much baggage. I've done so many things that I know are wrong. I've sinned in big ways. Jesus would say, you can come be on my team. Because in Jesus' kingdom, he takes weak people and he shows his power. Isn't that what Paul says? My power, Jesus told him, my power is perfected in weakness. It's shown through people who just don't have it together and who know it. I'm reading the book of Judges with Caleb right now. And we just studied Gideon. And the angel comes to Gideon and says, as he's hiding in a wine press and looks like the last person that you would ever pick to lead an army into battle, God is with you, O mighty warrior. It's not who Gideon was at the time. That's how God can take somebody and push him in a certain direction. God wants people who know that they are nothing. There's a really good reason that this is the first one that's brought up, because this is the foundation for all of the rest of the Beatitudes. If you're poor in spirit, then all of the rest of these will follow from that. So then you have those who mourn. You have those who recognize the horror of their sin. Those are the people who are going to be consoled. It's really interesting to think about who God is compared to who we are and what we have done with his blessings. Because from the moment that we enter the world, and even before that, when we're still in the womb, God is providing us with everything that we need. And so when we grow up, we have air, we have food, we have clothing, we have shelter, we have access to his mind and his spirit, we have a relationship. But despite all of these blessings, every single one of us, we are the only creatures in God's creation that has the opportunity to rebel, and we have all taken that opportunity. And it has required the blood of God's own Son in order to buy us back from that spiritual devastation that we all chose. And that sin that we have all participated in, that cannot be swept under a rug, even though we would sure like to do that sometimes, right? With sin in general. Even with sometimes the sin of the world. Well, how do you react when you see sin in the world? I think far too many times it's easy for me to look at the mess out there and just kind of go into hunker down mode and say, well, yeah, it's really bad, that's wicked, that's wrong, this leader's doing that, or this person over here is doing this, and that should not be the case, but, the world's evil, what are you going to do? Well, it should not be that way. And we may not always understand or know what is best to do about it all. We don't run the universe, and thank God for that. That's his job, not ours. But do you remember in 2 Peter what it said about Lot? How he tormented his righteous soul when he looked around and he saw the kinds of things that were happening in Sodom. Peter holds that up as evidence of Lot's righteousness. Are you looking at the world and not just kind of shrugging your shoulders, but are you looking at the world and its wrongs and mourning to some degree about that? Blessed are those who mourn, because they're going to be comforted. When you see somebody sin against you, our natural reaction is to just get mad at them for hurting us. But Jesus teaches us to mourn their sin. Mourn not just that they hurt us, but to mourn the devastation and the hurt that is caused to them because they've sinned. How do you react when you know that you yourself have sinned? Do you take time to sit in the weight of that? Or do you want to just kind of pray this quick prayer of, oh God, I didn't make the best choice right there. It wasn't the greatest thing to do. Please forgive me of that. Moving on. Some sins have greater consequences than others do. But we better not brush off what we're doing as something that's not a big deal to God, because it is. So blessed are those who mourn. And blessed are those who are meek. Those who don't fight for themselves will gain God's security. This is an interesting one. The word there for meek is the idea of being gentle or considerate or courteous. So meekness doesn't mean you never put up a fight about anything. Meekness just means you don't put up a fight for yourself. But that's our natural reaction to unjust treatment, isn't it? We want to rise up, especially when it's about us, especially when it's about my reputation, about how other people are looking at me. I want respect. That's the way our culture operates. But what we need to do is just back down and let God handle it. Because going back to Moses in Numbers 14, remember how that passage describes him as the meekest man on the face of the earth, which is interesting because Moses actually wrote down those words. But he was, because in that story, he gets married to a Cushite woman, and for whatever reason, his brother and sister have a big beef about that with him. They can't stand that. And so they start trying to pull rank. Well, God speaks through us too, doesn't he? And remember how God says, kind of like talking to children, okay, 3 of you to the tent right now. He comes in his glory, and he speaks to Miriam and to Aaron and says, look, I've got a special thing with Moses. You leave him alone. Moses could have thrown a fit about the way they were treating him, but he didn't. And Jesus says, if you're like that, you don't fight for yourself, then what are you going to receive? You're going to receive an inheritance. You're going to receive an inheritance of the earth, which can also be translated as land. Inheriting land in the ancient world especially was a very important thing. It didn't just mean, oh, now I've got, a couple of acres and I've got some dirt over there that I could do some things with it. Inheriting land meant I've got a secure place where generation after generation of my family can come and go in that spot, drinking from that spring over there, and we'll be safe and we'll be secure. We won't have to move around in tents all the time. It means security. And so in Jesus' kingdom, you don't have to stress about carving out your place in the world, about making other people look at you favorably. In Jesus' kingdom, you don't have to prove to anybody else that you are worthy of people's attention, that you're worthy of people's love. Because Jesus says in so many different places, I already love you, and I love you to the extent that I'll die for you. Blessed are those who are hungry and thirsty. Wouldn't usually think that hunger and thirst is a good thing, but when it's for righteousness, it is. Because those people, those people who yearn for a deeper spiritual life, those people are going to be filled. The people who are always hungry and thirsty will be the ones who are satisfied. It's one of the classic inverted, that is not the way that it seems, kind of passages in Jesus' teaching. So the people who are never satisfied with their current level of spiritual maturity are the ones who are going to be most content and close to Jesus. How does that work? Well, I think Jesus is teaching us the difference between obligation and appetite. You ever go to a restaurant and look at the kids who are eating around you? You're usually going to see two different kinds of kids. You're going to see the kids who get the burger on their plate, and they go, oh, okay, yeah, all right. And they nibble at it a little bit, maybe they eat a couple of fries, and then they're just glued to the TV for most of the rest of the time. And they leave the burger on the plate. And then you see the kids who go in there, and they're practically eating their shoes. And so they get the burger on the plate, and it's gone in 60 seconds because they're starving to death, and it's the best thing that they've ever tasted in their life. And I think that pretty well describes the kind of people who react to Jesus. Some people are going to nibble around the edges of Jesus. Maybe they'll even start excited, but if they're not truly hungry and thirsty, then that interest is going to die off after a while. And so you might see some people do some right things because they know that they're expected to do it, but they're not really excited about it. You know, maybe I'll pick up my Bible and I'll read it now and then because I should. Maybe you'll see them gather when Christians gather in the various places where they do that. Maybe you won't see them. But then you're going to see people who are like this, who have a hunger and thirst and excitement for God and everything about God. The words of God, the people of God. They're going to be with his people. They're going to be in the words. They're going to enjoy every beautiful detail of it because they know that it feeds their soul. Which person are you most like? Well, I'll have to answer that. Blessed are those who are merciful. Those moved by God's compassion shown to them are going to be the ones who are going to receive God's mercy and be able to show that to other people. You know, mercy does two things for us if we have it. It's going to cause us to actually see how people are upset or in need, have something that is lacking in their life. And not just will it cause us to see those things, mercy will push us to actually do something about what we have seen. You ever notice in the Gospels, we're going to read some of these stories where the disciples have big honking blinders on their eyes. Like they can't see things that Jesus can obviously see. Like, thousands of people are coming to hear him teach, and the disciples are going, okay, well, it's getting late, time to, make these people move away, so they can get their food. And Jesus is saying, no, we're not going to send them away. They're going to faint on the road. You give them something to eat. And when the disciples go, huh? Jesus goes, well, I will give them something to eat because I saw that they've got a need and I'm going to address it. That's what happens with the Good Samaritan in the Gospel of Luke. Not only does the Samaritan see the poor guy beaten up by the side of the road, he actually gets off of his animal. He doesn't just turn the other way. He gets off of his animal. He takes care of that guy. He brings him to an inn. He binds up his wounds. That's what mercy does. Because that's what our God does. It's just amazing to me that our God even sees us. When we are little bitty dirt specks on a little bitty planet. Earth is not that significant in our solar system or even the universe and all the galaxies out there. He sees all of our tiny little lives, and He cares about them, and He does so much that we can't even see or understand on behalf of us and what's going on with us. Are you aware? Are you even aware of the way other people are hurting? Do you look up from your family's personal calendar and say, well, I know this person's got this need, or there's this thing coming up for somebody else. Let me devote half a Saturday for that. Half a Saturday. I know for a lot of us who work Monday through Friday, half a Saturday is like 25% of your off time. Sometimes that's called for, if you have mercy. Blessed are those who are pure in heart, for they shall be the ones who see God. Those people who want to personally experience Him are going to choose to resemble Him. You know, when companies sell you bottled water, what they really like to advertise is, it's purified, which means that, all of the big chunks of whatever and all the small little microscopic chunks of whatever are cleaned out of that water so that it becomes appealing for you to drink it. This is the basic idea of somebody who's spiritually pure, is their hearts are not mixed with all kinds of impurities like selfish ambition or other motives that are contrary to the gospel. And why do people become pure? Well, you think about, if we're talking about a king, who gets to go into the presence of a king? Well, it's people who meet the standard of that king's idea of what beauty looks like or what wisdom looks like. Do you remember in Genesis, when Joseph was called in out of his little prison to go into the Pharaoh? There's actually a little passage in Genesis, I think it's Genesis 41, where he actually shaves himself and he changes his clothes. I think it's just interesting that Scripture even bothers to mention that. Because when you come into the presence of a king, you don't go in there looking like a shaggy Neanderthal. You wash yourself and you put on clothes and you take your beard off or you take it down and you make yourself presentable. Do we take this seriously? The Netflix shows that we consume, the movies that we watch, the books that we read, the entertainment that is such a massive industry in our culture, since we have often more downtime than the typical culture of the world. Are we pure in what we consume? Are we pure in how we think and in what we do? Lots to think about with that application, but for the sake of time, we've got to move on. Blessed are the peacemakers, not the peacekeepers, not the peaceful personality types, the peacemakers. Those who work hard to create harmony between God and His people are God's family, the sons of God, because that is exactly what God Himself does. So we're not just talking about somebody who is nice here. We're not just talking about somebody who has kind of kind words, usually who's kind of the peacemaker of his family. Some people will talk about that. We're talking about somebody who acts as a mediator between him and between people, and often between people with themselves. Because that's the context of the rest of the sermon. You keep reading in chapter 5. In the same way, verse 16, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. Matthew 5:44, but I say to you, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. Chapter 6, verse 10. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. All this sermon is chock full of phrases and ideas that fit into what he's saying right here of, I'm going to try to bring people, sometimes kicking and screaming, to the God who created them and to each other so that we can be one with him. That is the idea of what he's talking about here. I think that it's interesting that this word that Jesus uses, peacemaker, was a word that Greek and Roman rulers would use to talk about imposing their will on an area, bringing their soldiers in, and making peace, which was really, most of the time, just kind of a veneer peace. But a Christian peacemaker goes into the dark places of people's lives and speaks truth to those people and says, why don't you come closer to God? And why don't you come closer to the people who care about God? Are you doing that? And then finally, blessed are the persecuted. Those who suffer because they love Jesus' welcoming more than the world's. It's interesting to me that Jesus actually gives a double blessing right here. So with the rest of the Beatitudes, he just says, blessed are, and then he moves on to the next one. But I want you to notice in verse 10, that's our Beatitude, but then he expands on it, and again he says, blessed are. And so what I think he's doing is he's giving us a transition from these blessings to the rest of the sermon in Matthew 5 through 7. This is, by the way, in verse 12, the only time you're going to see a command in the Beatitudes, which is rejoice. Be glad, for your reward in heaven is great. And notice how he's changing the tone of his language for this part. Because up to this moment, he said, blessed are those, blessed are they, theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And now in this one, he's changing the pronoun to you. Blessed are you when this happens. That's a lot more personal in verse 11. I think what he's saying is, I see the people who care about me enough to live in a way that reflects me, to speak my words, and to get flack for that. I see you. I see you. Did you notice also that in verse 3, the way that Jesus begins with this promise, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, it's the same as verse 10. Blessed are those who are persecuted, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. There's symmetry for that. I think Jesus has good reasons for saving this as the last one, because if you are the kind of person who's described in the first 9 verses here, then verses 10 and 11 is going to happen to you. So our goal can't be to live in such a way that people don't get frustrated with us. That's going to happen. The beginning of verse 12 is a choice that we make. Also notice the kind of persecution that he's talking about here. Is he talking about being burned at the stake? Is he talking about getting sewn up into lion skins and dying in a coliseum somewhere? What kind of persecution is he describing? He's describing insults. He's describing people using their words with terrible, barbed language and hurling it at your face. Sometimes, especially when I was growing up, I hear Christians say all the time, we don't get persecuted in this country. And to some extent, that's true. None of us are in danger of going up on crosses tomorrow. But this is a legitimate description of persecution. We absolutely do get persecuted in this country if we are the kind of person that he's describing here in this part of the sermon. And that experience, he says, needs to be reframed as a privilege and not as a curse. Blessed are you when this happens to you, because, verse 12, two things are true. Number one, your reward is great in heaven. It's the kingdom of heaven, after all. God is in a place that cannot be conquered, and he will be secure for you. But also, you get to imitate the people who have gone before you, who have been in the same shoes as you. So you're blessed. You're secure. So how do we sum all this up? Yes, I know I've gone a little bit long this morning. I appreciate your patience. There was a lot to talk about in 1 through 12. This part of the sermon is about how God can take you and give you something that nobody else can provide. A rich reward. And how does that happen? Well, I want to suggest that every one of these Beatitudes are promises. Did you notice that? Read it again. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs might be, theirs is. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall. Blessed are the meek, for they shall. Blessed who hunger and thirst, for they shall. They shall. These are things that will happen, not possibly, not might. So he's saying, seize these promises and make them your own because he said them. Now, this is really cool. And frankly, I'm ashamed to say I had never noticed this before last week in studying for this sermon. But coming right off of chapter 4, verse 4, where Jesus says, quotes from the Old Testament and says, every word that proceeds from the mouth of God is what we live by. Do you notice in Matthew 5, verse 2, how Matthew phrases the way that Jesus starts? He opened his mouth and taught them, saying, he did not have to say it that way, but he did. And I think the proximity to chapter 4 is a good hint that we should take it that way. We have nothing to offer Jesus, but he has everything to offer us through the words that we live by if we believe them. That's what gives us life. Do you want to become the person who Jesus blesses? Then become the person who follows Jesus. In some ways, it is that simple. He will change you. You won't change yourself. But he will change you into somebody completely different. It's somebody who has a different focus, a different reason for getting out of bed than what you'll find anywhere else in religions or the world at large. He is the king, and he wants to be your king. So if he's not this morning, I encourage you to let him. He's not going to force you into his kingdom. It's not the way that this works. There aren't armies that are going to come tramping through Rantoul or Muhammad or Champaign. But the words of God will continually knock at your door, as they do today, inviting you to obey them, inviting you to come to Jesus so that he can bless you. Think about your life. I'll think about mine. Let's stand and sing the song Caleb suggested.